Michael, always good to see you. A key summit, of course, for Sir Keir Starmer and the other European leaders that gathered. This coalition of the willing that has been mentioned since then. What do we know about it?
Yeah, Neil, it has to be a coalition of the willing because NATO makes decisions by consensus, and we've got at least two countries in NATO, Slovakia and Hungary, who've essentially said they'll veto everything that is not in line with their view that we should be accommodating President Putin. So it can't be a NATO framework, so it has to be a coalition of the willing. And we're not sure yet who are the willing. Britain and France have pitched in, and Britain and France are important here because they are the two European powers who are most militarily capable.
Absolutely.
Lots of other powers have got things they can do and bigger forces than ours, but only Britain and France can send forces abroad and sustain them and bring them back, and have got world-class forces, though very small numbers. So the fact that the Britain and France are operating together is really important. But it's interesting to know who is in and who is out of this coalition of the willing.
I mean, there are some who just wouldn't want to be part of this, as you've already intimated.
There's some who've said we can't be part of it. So Spain has said that we're not willing for different reasons. Germany isn't because they're in the middle of a transition of government. So Chancellor Scholz was at the meeting in Lancaster House yesterday. You can't imagine that Friedrich Merz won't be in it once he's got his coalition together and he is officially Chancellor. In Poland's an interesting case. I mean, Donald Tusk was there, who I think instinctively is very much in favour of this, but the Poles have got an army of 110,000 troops. I mean,
and they're all pointed eastwards at the moment.
Pointing eastwards, yeah. And they're half as big again as the British army. But they don't like the idea of sending significant numbers of their forces to Ukraine because they think they will need them on their own border. So they've got an issue. We don't know really who's in. We don't know who's definitely in, other than Britain and France. We think Italy is almost certainly in. Giorgia Meloni was there, and she's made some fairly strong statements. Canada is probably in. I think the Baltic states, who were not there yesterday, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they're quite annoyed that they didn't get invitations. And
Sir Keir Starmer had to phone.
He had to phone them and calm them down. But they are very small, and they're very determined, they're very brave, they're very tough on this because they know what it's like to live under Russian control. But they could offer, I'm sure they would offer very determined but very small forces. But they would be in. More key, to my mind, would be Finland. They've got very capable forces at high numbers if necessary. Sweden, important too. But we just don't know, until this goes a bit further down the track, we don't really know who's going to be in.
There's going to be an awful lot of hypothesising going on. But in terms of how it might practically work, I mean, absent NATO, which you say just isn't an option, how do you run a multi-nation force such as the one that's being proposed?
Well, this is the benefit of NATO. It would run on NATO lines, even if it's not a NATO operation. These countries are used to NATO procedures. They practice together. They know what it is. They click together. There was a fabulous example of that, going back a way now, 1991. I mean, all the European forces went to the Gulf in the 1991 war to liberate Kuwait from Saddam Hussein's naked aggression. And it wasn't a NATO operation at all, but they ran just as if it was a NATO operation because they were used to it. And that's the point. When European forces in NATO ever go out of area, as it's called, then they just click together because they know how to. So I think that wouldn't be a particular issue. And again, Britain and France have got the multinational headquarters. So in our case, it'd be northward. The French have got a couple of multinational headquarters. You could run a big operation either from France or from Britain. The bigger issue really is what would they be required to do? And that's not clear until the outlines of some sort of truce deal were more obvious. And they've talked about a number of issues, a number of possibilities, but they're all sort of floating in air until we get some more specific ideas about what might be desirable and required.
So I suppose the one thing that we can say is that Europe, its individual constituent parts, I mean, people are going to be spending more on defence if they're not already doing so.
Yes, I mean, Britain thinks it's set the shown the way in that with the statement a couple of weeks ago now to spend more on defence. So we're going from our 2.3% of GDP to 2.5% by 2027. And we all know that we're going towards 3%. The question is when, and probably we'll go above that. And again, I come back to this sort of large, big picture thing. When the Cold War ended in 1990-91, we were spending 4% of our GDP on defence. We were spending about the same on defence as we were spending on health. And now we spend about a quarter on defence that we spend on health. During the Cold War, in the middle of the Cold War, we were spending 7% of our GDP on defence. And I would posit that the era we're going into in the late 20s, early 30s will feel a lot more like the 50s and 60s than anything else. And so, sadly, I think we will go to 3%, and I think we'll be pushing then to 4 or maybe 5% if we're going to maintain our lifestyle, our sense of security and prosperity, because it can break down very quickly, and Europe is likely to be more or less on its own. With a conditional, I don't think the Americans will desert Europe, but their commitment to it will be conditioned.
I mean, what is clear to me, correct me if I'm wrong, is that there's going to have to be spending, and probably an awful lot of spending for an organisation such as this, for a bringing together of military forces from a variety of nations.
And I think the other side of this, I mean, what this initiative is trying to do is to create the idea of a proposal for a ceasefire. So this sounds a bit peculiar in a way. A 1-month ceasefire by air and sea, and also the protection of critical national infrastructure in Ukraine. Now,
just an opportunity to put the guns down and crack on with sorting out everything else.
To say, I mean, a ceasefire on the ground is probably really hard to organise. Yeah. But we could conceive of a ceasefire at sea. That's not too difficult to organise. A ceasefire in the air is more difficult, because what about drones? Are we talking about just aircraft or helicopters? I mean, an awful lot of stuff goes on below 2,000 and 3,000 feet. So what do you mean by air? And that would take some definition. The protection of infrastructure in Ukraine, that's easy to define. Whether it's practical or not, what I think the British and the French are trying to do is to say, look, we have a preliminary truce proposal, a 1-month cessation, just to get us started. And what they want is for President Zelensky to accept that, because Putin will almost certainly turn it down. And what they want is to call the Russians bluff, is to say, look, we've got a proposal. The Ukrainians have accepted it. Please note, President Trump, the Ukrainians are in favour of this proposal. The Russians aren't. And to keep putting it to the Kremlin, get the Kremlin to keep denying it, keep finding reasons why they think it's ridiculous, and let the Americans draw their conclusions from that.
But do you think the Americans are likely to draw the conclusions that we wish them to draw, given what we saw taking place in the Oval Office between Zelensky, Trump, and Vance? I mean, that was catastrophic.
It was, yeah. I mean, Neil, honestly, in the annals of diplomacy, that one goes down as a classic, for all the wrong reasons, which we don't need to go over now. But I mean, we're all aware of it. And we don't quite know yet what the longer-term effect of that might be. So was it a bit of stage theatricality to put Zelensky in his place and make President Trump feel better? But maybe it was an exchange which just got out of control, which went wrong, which left the Americans more genuinely angry than they feel. And maybe it will have an effect in giving the Americans a sense that we cannot deal with this man. So we need a new Ukrainian leader to deal with, or we will not deal with Ukraine at all.
Well, was that security summit in London then as much about keeping the Americans on side as presenting a united view of Europe? I mean, it's no coincidence that he was talking about a coalition of the willing. Where have I heard those words before?
Coalition of the willing in 2003 was Britain, America and Australia, 3 of us, against the rest of the world. And as I've said before, I mean, it's all in public now, so you can say it. But a very high-ranking British official in the Ministry of Defence, the Permanent Undersecretary, said at the time, before the invasion started in 2003, he said, if the Americans are making a strategic blunder, we must not allow them to make it alone. We are with the Americans, right or wrong, because our longer-term interests are with the Americans. So here we are, coalition of the willing, and Keir Starmer, I mean, they've done a lot of preparation now, Downing Street, before Keir Starmer went last week, on the phrases and the arguments, the way to put things to this present White House, and they got it right, by and large. He used all the triggering phrases that he knew that Trump would respond to. And then the letter from the King. I mean, that made most people's toes curl.
Oh, 100%.
But
it works.
Invitation to a state, for a state visit. Yeah, it was toe curling, but toe curling to us, but it worked for them. That was the point. So, yes, all of that is, and all of the summit, this Lancaster House summit yesterday, was really to try to convince the Americans that Zelensky is the man you're going to have to deal with. We rate him. We regard him as the legitimate president of Ukraine, as do now most Ukrainians. I mean, he had 57% approval ratings when Trump said his approval ratings were 4%. They're actually 57%, and they've gone up quite a lot since. So here's the man you're going to have to deal with. And let's get back on terms. Let's think of a way round of getting Zelensky to say the right things, of getting the metals deal, the minerals deal back on track, because you're keen on that. And let's get the diplomatic momentum going, because at the moment the Russians are getting everything they want by saying and doing nothing. Totally. Let's make the Russians react, and then let the Americans see how the Russians react to some specific proposals.
Can this work, this coalition of the willing? Can there be security provided to Ukraine in the event of a ceasefire without the Americans?
A degree of security could be, but it'd be risky. That's the point. I mean, the Europeans could put troops of a certain number into. They wouldn't put them all the way along the border, because the border is 1,000 kilometres long. It'd be the longest peacekeeping border in history by some measure. But they could put groups of troops in 2 or 3 centres with very good communication. So lots of helicopters, lots of ground transport to get to a trouble spot quickly and do something about it. But without America's backup, without America being there as some sort of backstop, the chances of those troops having to fight would be quite high. And that would mean that European leaders who engaged in this would have to be a lot braver than they've been so far. So, yes, you could do it. Yes, you could have, let's say, 50, 60,000 European troops, of whom maybe 10,000 could be British. So, yes, you could do it. Yes, it would have some effect, but it would be risky because, again, it isn't just necessarily that the Russians might play games. The Ukrainians might play games to provoke the Russians into breaking a ceasefire, to provoke a crisis that might then, they think, suit them. So it's not all a one-sided issue here, even though it's basically Russian aggression that we're all talking about.
Do you think that Donald Trump is currently minded to have a longer-term commitment to Ukraine? It doesn't look like that to me.
No, I think he's currently minded to get it off the table.
Yeah.
He doesn't really care about Ukraine. I know he doesn't care about Ukraine. He doesn't care about NATO and European security very much. He doesn't care about Taiwan. Doesn't care about the Palestinians. He just wants them off the table to get on with what he does care about, which is trade, creating American economic predominance in as many parts of the world as possible, and physically enlarging American territory. He's serious about Greenland. I promise you he's serious about Greenland. He's pretty serious about Panama. He may or may not be serious about Canada, but he's taken to insulting Trudeau by calling him Governor Trudeau instead of Prime Minister Trudeau. I mean, I think that's a bit of theatre. But he is serious about enlarging American territory. And it's not so outlandish as you might imagine, because 40% of American territory as it presently exists, of US territory, was purchased. So Louisiana purchased from France.
You're taking me back to my school days,
Yeah, Alaska from Russia, parts of California from Spain. So 40% of US territory was bought from somebody else. And the United States on 3 other occasions has thought about trying to purchase Greenland from Denmark. And so it's not entirely outlandish that he should try to, but he's determined to be a president who enlarged America physically, because he's got a sort of an imperialist mindset. Those are the things he cares about. And what I'm sure he's trying to do, he wants to get off the table all these things which enmesh America, which commit America to things that he doesn't feel are directly in America's interests. So he wants to sort them out, leave them to somebody else to get on with what he does care about: trade, economic dominance, and physical enlargement of the US continent.
So if we assume that the United States doesn't provide this backstop, just for a second, it feels like Europe is going in one direction. There is closer working relationships when it comes specifically to defence.
Yeah.
Is Europe capable of defending itself?
Well, they could with more spending on the things that really matter. I mean, the Europeans spend, $475 billion worth on military, and they don't get 475 billions worth of stuff
don't.
for it because
No,
they
they
spend
don't.
it on the wrong things. If they spent more wisely, more genuinely cooperatively, if they were less protectionist about their own defence industries, and I'm looking here particularly at France, then they would get a lot more for it.
Sure, but will minds be sharpened in that manner without there being further conflict on the eastern flanks of Europe?
Well, I think we're heading towards that equation. You know, would minds are certainly being sharpened.
Mm-hmm.
So will the commitment now be being made? I mean, what we've seen in the last couple of weeks is extraordinary in European terms.
Yes,
Neither of us would have predicted it 2 years ago.
No.
But here we are. We're in new territory now, partly provoked by the United States. I mean, you know, the advent of Trump, I mean, has, as it were, unintended consequences. Some of them are probably quite good, and so. We are making a bigger commitment. Will we have made that commitment before we need to put it into practice? I don't know. I mean, one thing I'm fairly sure about, if the Russians come out of this Ukraine crisis feeling that they've won, that America's basically given them what they want, they know that they've got 4 years of Trump. But they will know that if they've got Trump for 4 years, this is their opportunity. Bear in mind, too, that Putin is, 72 going on 73. He will have momentum. Mm-hmm. He's got a war economy which is not very efficient, and it's certainly straining. But things, you know, his war economy can't just be turned on and off like a tap. So his sense that this is the moment of momentum, the moment of opportunity in Moldova, in Georgia, in the Baltic states, against Britain. I mean, they really want to humiliate Britain. You know, they perceive, I think probably wrongly now, that we're isolated from our European partners, where we don't have the influence with America. They think that if they can humiliate Britain, then they will send a message to everybody else. So we're in the crosshairs as and when the Russians feel they can relax a bit in Ukraine.
Michael, always good to see you. Thanks very much.